One could just as easily accept the historicity of Jack and the Beanstalk on the same basis as long as one's sole criterion for historical plausibility is anything goes. If there are ancient parallel legends about other saviors and sages rising from death or ascending into heaven, but there is no present-day instance, is the historian to be maligned as a narrow dogmatist or a moral coward refusing to repent if he judges the story of Jesus' resurrection as probably a legend too?
This, I love Bob. Bob's so on point here. So on point.
The historical axiom of analogy does not dogmatize. Critical historians are not engaging in metaphysics and epistemology as if they could hop into a time machine and pontificate, A didn't happen, B did. Again, Dr. Craig and his brethren are just projecting. It is they and not critical historians who want to be able to point to sure results. Imagine a creed. If thou shalt confess with thy mouth the Lord Jesus and believe in thy heart that God hath probably raised him from the dead, thou shalt most likely be saved.
Look, there's no one who does this like Robert Price, honestly. This guy is so witty. So witty. I want to draw your attention to a well-known debate in my mind. Robert M. Price versus William Lane Craig, did Jesus rise from the dead? This is actually, it should have been more views than it has ever had. Many of the videos we've responded to or reacted to so far have been from atheists who are approaching things from a purely scientific angle, showing why naturalism is true, why science leads toward a God not existing likely. However, William Lane Craig, who's a great debater, loves to go to Jesus, right? And his experience is the primary place he goes to. Well, nobody I know is more of a Bible guru debating William Lane Craig than Robert and Price. So we're going to get a very honed-in, zeroed-in view of the New Testament, dealing with did Jesus rise from the dead from a New Testament scholar, Robert and Price, with William Lane Craig. I won't waste any more of your time, but this may be a two-part video. Let's see how it goes.
Did Jesus of Nazareth rise from the dead? Please welcome with me Dr. William Lane Craig and Dr. Robert Price. Dr. William Lane Craig received his PhD in philosophy from the University of Birmingham, England, and his PhD in theology from the University of Munich, Germany, where he was a fellow of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, studying the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus. And we'll begin with Dr. Craig for 20 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, and good evening. Let me begin by expressing my gratitude to the Veritas Forum for the invitation to discuss this important question tonight with Robert Price. Now, in our discussion this evening, I'm not going to treat the New Testament as a wholly inspired and therefore infallible book, but rather simply as a collection of ordinary Greek documents coming down out of the first century. I'm not interested, therefore, in defending the inerrancy of the Gospels. Rather, we're interested in determining what facts they do credibly establish concerning Jesus' fate and what is the best explanation of those facts. Accordingly, in tonight's debate, I'm going to defend two basic contentions. Number one, the New Testament documents establish four facts concerning Jesus' fate: his honorable burial, the discovery of his empty tomb, his post-mortem appearances, and the origin of the disciples' belief in his resurrection. And number two, the best explanation of these facts is that God raised Jesus from the dead. So let's look at that first contention together. I'm going to share with you four facts which are widely accepted by New Testament historians today. It's worth emphasizing that I'm not talking just about conservative scholars, but about the broad mainstream of New Testament scholarship. Fact number one. After his crucifixion, Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea in a tomb. This fact is highly significant because it means the location of Jesus' grave was known. As Dr. Price himself admits, it's hard to imagine that the disciples could have believed in Jesus' resurrection, much less persuaded others, if the occupied tomb of Jesus had stood there, refuting them by its very presence. And New Testament scholars have established the fact of Jesus' honorable burial on the basis of evidence such as the following. Number one, Jesus' burial is attested in the very old information handed on by Paul in his first letter to the Corinthians. Can I have the overhead, please? Good. In this chapter, Paul says, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, And then comes this formula that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. This old information has been dated to within 5 years after Jesus' crucifixion. The second line of this saying refers to Jesus' burial. Comparison of this four-line formula to the gospel narratives on the one hand and to the apostles' sermons in the book of Acts on the other hand reveals that this second line is a summary of the burial story of Jesus in the tomb by Joseph of Arimathea. Thank you. Number two, the burial story is part of the very old source material used by Mark in writing his gospel. Since Mark is the earliest of the Gospels, his source material goes even closer back to the events of Jesus' life. And thus we have very early independent attestation of the burial in both Mark and Paul. Three, as a member of the Jewish
independent
high court that condemned Jesus, Joseph of Arimathea is unlikely to be a Christian invention. There was an understandable hostility in the early church toward the Jewish leaders who, in Christian eyes, had engineered a judicial murder of Jesus. And thus, according to the late New Testament scholar Raymond Brown, Jesus' honorable burial by Joseph is very probable, since a Christian fictional creation of a Jewish Sanhedrist who does what is right for Jesus is, and I quote, almost inexplicable. Four, the burial story lacks any signs of legendary development. Even Rudolf Bultmann, one of the most skeptical scholars of this century, declared, "This is an historical account, which creates no impression of being a legend apart from the women witnesses." The eminent scholar of the book of Mark, Vincent Taylor, says that even Bultmann's assessment is a notable understatement. The narrative belongs to the best tradition. And number five, no other competing burial story exists. If the story of Jesus' burial were a legendary fiction, which arose much later than the original event, then it's strange that we have no traces at all of the original account or even of competing legendary stories. The unanimity of the burial traditions speaks in favor of the reliability of the gospel account. For these and other reasons, the majority of New Testament critics concur that Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea in a tomb. According to the late John A.T. Robinson of Cambridge University, the burial of Jesus in the tomb is one of the earliest and best attested facts about Jesus. Fact number two. On the Sunday after the crucifixion, Jesus' tomb was found empty by a group of his women followers. Among the reasons which have led most scholars to this conclusion are the following. Number one, the old information transmitted by Paul implies the empty tomb. Overhead, please. It does so in two ways. First, the expression, "he was raised," following the expression, "he was buried," implies an empty tomb. A first-century Jew could not have thought otherwise. That reference is being made here to Jesus' empty tomb is again evident by comparing this four-line summary with the gospel accounts of the resurrection. And you discover that the third line corresponds to the empty tomb narrative. Second, the expression...
And by the way, it's really weird listening to him get into the weeds, which I'm glad he is, because Robert M. Price is definitely the weed man. Totally kidding. He is definitely someone who gets into the weeds. But I find it interesting that he dies on the hill that this must be an empty tomb. Of course, he buys the whole package. Some scholars say he doesn't mention an empty tomb. He just says he was buried. Now, he could have been buried in a tomb. He could have been buried whatever. I tend to go whatever. I have no problem with suggesting that this might be implying a tomb for me. But then again, the tomb is legendary as well. So maybe the Gospels are building off the legend of Paul, or that Paul's legendary empty tomb notion, or Paul, using Nina Livesey and others, maybe even Robert M. Price, this text may be coming after the Gospels, building upon the prior already existing narratives with the empty tomb. Anyway, I'm sure we'll hear some of this stuff from Robert M. Price, but William Lane Craig is like taking this so literal and like this is historical. And I think to myself, there's several different texts in the ancient world that have empty tombs, that have missing bodies. And if you take those to the bank, you've got a miracle on your hands.
On the third day is probably a time indicator for the women's discovery of the empty tomb. Very briefly summarized, the question here is how the resurrection came to be dated on the third day. Why not the seventh day or the 10th day? Well, the most probable answer is that it was on the third day after the crucifixion, according to Jewish reckoning, that the women discovered the tomb empty. And so naturally, the resurrection came to be dated on that day. And thus, in Paul's information, we have two extremely early indications of the fact of the empty tomb. Thank you. Two, the empty tomb story is also part of Mark's very old source material. Mark's source did not end with Jesus' burial, but with the empty tomb narrative, which is tied to the burial account by verbal and grammatical similarities. And thus, again, we have very early, independent attestation of the fact of the empty tomb.
So hold on. Grammatical connections to the statement of the empty tomb with Paul, but we have to argue they're independent. How do you know they're independent? You don't know that.
Three, the story is simple and lacks signs of legend.
And in fact, many scholars have, I say that because it's like, if you haven't read, there are many academics who say Mark's gospel is intertextual with Paul's letters. So it knows of Paul's letters. So they're not independent.
Secondary embellishment. In Mark's account, the women come to the tomb early Sunday morning and find the stone rolled away and the tomb empty. They see an angelic figure who proclaims to them that Jesus is risen and will appear to them in Galilee. They flee from the tomb in terror and silence. Now, to appreciate the simplicity of this account, one has only to compare it to the accounts in the forged apocryphal Gospels of the 2nd century and beyond. For example, in the so-called Gospel of Peter, the tomb is encompassed by a Roman guard, all the Jewish chief priests and Pharisees, as well as a huge crowd from the surrounding countryside. Suddenly, during the night, a voice rings out from heaven, and the stone over the tomb rolls back by itself from the door. Then 2 angels descend out of heaven and enter into the tomb. Then Jesus himself comes out of the tomb, upheld by the 2 angels. The heads of the 2 angels reach up to the clouds, but the head of Jesus overpasses the clouds. Then a cross comes out of the tomb, and a voice from heaven asks, "Hast thou preached to them that sleep?" And the cross answers, "Yea." Now,
just because that's fiction and we know that's fiction doesn't mean the Gospels aren't fiction.
This is how real legends look.
No, that's not necessarily how real legends look. That's an obvious one that nobody should buy, just like Enoch's 450-foot giants. But if you looked at other materials, take Euripides' Bacchae, and you find the fantastic in there, but it's not overly ridiculous, especially compared to the Gospels. Like, they have milk and honey and water that comes out of the earth and wine and things like that, miracles, just like the Gospels have. The ones you claim are more historical.
They're colored by all sorts of apologetical and theological motifs, which are conspicuously missing from the account in the book of Mark.
No, but anyway.
At the very most, we would only want to excise from Mark's account the angelic figure as an embellishment, and what remains is stark in its simplicity. 4, the tomb was probably discovered empty by women. In Jewish society, the testimony of women was regarded as so unreliable that they were not even permitted to serve as legal witnesses in a Jewish court of law. Now, in light of this fact, how remarkable it is that it is women who are the discoverers of Jesus' empty tomb. Any later legendary account would certainly have made male disciples like Peter and John to discover the empty tomb. The fact that it is women rather than men who are the chief witnesses to the fact of the empty tomb is best explained by the fact that they were the discoverers of the empty tomb, and the gospel writers faithfully record what, for them, was a rather awkward and embarrassing fact. And number 5, the earliest Jewish response presupposes the empty tomb. In Matthew 28, we find the earliest Jewish response to the disciples' proclamation of the resurrection. What were Jews saying in response to the disciples' proclamation, "He is risen from the dead"? That these men were full of new wine? That his body still lay in the tomb out on the hillside? No. They were saying the disciples came and stole away his body. Now think about that for a second. The disciples came and stole away his body. The earliest Jewish response to the proclamation of the resurrection was itself an attempt to explain why the body was missing. And thus we have evidence for the empty tomb from the very opponents of the early Christian movement. I could go on.
Oh my God. So he's using the story to prove the story. Not only that, though, women did have... he's talking about rabbinic post-70 AD, like later rabbinic sources that 2nd, 3rd century rabbis may say women don't have any say in testimonial cases, certain types of cases. But that's not the case in Greco-Roman law in Judea during the 1st century. That's not the case in biblical precedent. So the idea that they would invent this, or they would never invent women coming to the tomb, is silly. And another way to look at it is how many women were the first ones to retrieve the body of the god or demigod post-mortem. So the Maenads with, let's say, Dionysus, for example, or let's look at Osiris with Isis. Isis searches for the body of Osiris in those stories, and she discovers the body and mourns over the body. There's other examples. Dennis MacDonald brings up the Homeric examples with Hector fighting with Achilles. 3 women are up on the top tower inside of the city, and they're mourning from a distance, watching the death of Hector. There's all sorts of examples you could look to, but the idea that women would not be, and they wouldn't make this up, is just a silly apologetic that I see.
But I think that enough has been said to indicate why, in the words of Jakob Kramer, an Austrian specialist on the resurrection, by far most exegetes hold firmly to the reliability of the biblical statements concerning the empty tomb. Fact number 3. On multiple occasions and under various circumstances, different individuals and groups saw appearances of Jesus alive after his death. This is a fact which is virtually universally acknowledged by New Testament scholars today for the following reason. Overhead, please.
By the way, before he continues, again, just something that did come to my mind is Mark likes to reverse expectations as well. So like the last shall be first, the first shall be last. If the guys are there first and they all flee in fear and they're not around, isn't it also a reversal of expectation that the first gospel, Mark, has women come to the tomb and they're the first ones to get it? Meaning this could all be literary.
Number 1, the list of eyewitnesses to Jesus' resurrection appearances, which is quoted by Paul, guarantees that such appearances occurred. Paul goes on to say, then he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. Given the early date of this information, as well as Paul's personal acquaintance with the people involved, such appearances can't be dismissed as legendary, but must refer to actual events. Thank you. Number 2, the appearance narratives in the Gospels provide multiple independent attestation of the appearances. For example, the appearance to Peter is attested by Luke and Paul. The appearance to the 12 is attested by Luke, John, and Paul.
I can't imagine. I wish this was in video format. It's unfortunate that the actual video I have nowhere to find. I don't know how to find it. Robert and Price, I guarantee you, is sitting here going, gosh, I got to listen to another 10 minutes. There's 5 minutes of this, whatever. Because all of this could be explained through intertextual. There could be definite awareness and not be independent. I mean, there's just no reason to act like these texts somehow are solidifying the historicity and reliability of what actually happened. It's now where I'm at. It's like, this is silly.
The appearance to the women is attested by Matthew and John. The appearances in Galilee are attested by Mark, Matthew, and John. The appearance narratives span such a broad spectrum of independent sources that it cannot be reasonably denied that the earliest disciples did have such experiences, even if it's impossible to prove the historicity of any particular appearance story. Even the skeptical German New Testament critic Gert Lüdemann therefore
he loves quoting this skeptic in his rhetorical debates every damn time. He might do it with Bart Ehrman too, but it's like a common thing that they do.
Concludes, it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. Finally, fact number 4.
Historically certain. I could not disagree more with that kind of confidence, you know.
Original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that Jesus was risen from the dead, despite their having every predisposition to the contrary. Think of the situation that confronted the disciples following Jesus' crucifixion. Number 1, their leader was dead. And Jewish messianic expectations had no idea of a Messiah who, instead of triumphing over Israel's enemies, would be shamefully executed as a criminal. 2, according to Old Testament law, Jesus' execution exposed him as a heretic, a man literally accursed by God. 3, Jewish beliefs about the afterlife precluded anyone's rising from the dead to glory and immortality before the general resurrection at the end of the world. Nevertheless, the original disciples suddenly came to believe so strongly that God had raised Jesus from the dead, that they were willing to die for the truth of that belief.
Now we're getting to martyrdom. It's like the typical sequence of apologetic events.
Luke Johnson, a New Testament scholar at Emory University, states some sort of powerful, transformative experience is required to generate the sort of movement earliest Christianity was. N.T. Wright, an eminent British scholar, concludes that is why, as an historian,
I think Bob calls him N.T. wrong.
I cannot explain the rise of early Christianity unless Jesus rose again, leaving an empty grave behind him.
It's kind of weird, too, when you go back to ancient Dionysian Maenad-type worship. The Maenads in the Dionysian cult was persecuted. In the earliest Homeric hymns, I believe Hesiod mentions this. We definitely get it in like Aeschylus and Euripides and various other Greek writers. And then, of course, this all the way down into the Common Era. There's persecution of this Dionysus cult, and it still thrives and continues. So, like, that proves its divinity, I guess.
In summary, then, there are 4 facts agreed upon by the majority of scholars: Jesus' burial by Joseph of Arimathea, the discovery of his empty tomb, his post-mortem appearances, and the origin of the disciples' belief. And thus, the majority of scholars would agree with my first contention. Dr. Price, however, does not. He denies all 4 of these facts. But that would be putting it too mildly, for he doesn't deny merely these 4 facts. He denies that Jesus of Nazareth ever really existed at all. He writes, "It is quite likely that the central figure of the gospel is not based on any historical individual. If you could travel through time back to first century Nazareth, you would not find a Jesus living there." Now, no New Testament historian or scholar believes such a thing. Even radical critics on the left wing of New Testament scholarship recognize that Jesus was a real historical individual who suffered execution by crucifixion during the administration of Pontius Pilate. We've seen that in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul transmits information concerning Jesus' crucifixion, burial, and resurrection appearances. In order to avert the force of this evidence, Dr. Price is driven to claiming that this passage was not originally part of Paul's letter, but was inserted much later by a copyist. No one believes such a thing. The whole of New Testament scholarship, whether liberal, moderate, or conservative, disagrees with this view. They are so far left, they're off the radar screen. By contrast, the case...
So the guy who's laughing at someone who doubts the historicity thinks a guy came out of a grave and really resurrected. He's within the kosher camp of acceptability. This is one of the problems I see within New Testament scholarship today, is that guys like Craig and other apologist types, N.T. Wright and others, who believe this shit really happened, they're in favor of being a part of the crowd of even critical scholars who would disagree on the resurrection, but the guy who thinks he probably didn't exist, let's mock that guy. But the guy who thinks Jews who floated up into the clouds, he's still okay even though we don't agree with him.
The case that I've presented tonight would be agreed to not just by conservatives, but by the majority of New Testament scholars today. But that leads to my second basic contention, that the best explanation of these facts is that God raised Jesus from the dead. Now, most scholars, I think, would say that as strict historians, such a conclusion lies beyond their reach. Not that they have any better explanation to offer. All of the old theories, like the disciples stole the body, or Jesus wasn't really dead, have been universally rejected by contemporary scholarship. The fact is that there just is no plausible, naturalistic explanation of these facts. Those who are reluctant to infer the resurrection of Jesus as the best explanation, because it is supernatural in character, are simply self-confessedly left with no explanation. But what I want to say is that surely, insofar as we are not merely historians, but human beings searching for the meaning of life and existence, we cannot be debarred from drawing such a conclusion. Given the admitted failure of all naturalistic explanations, the rational man can now hardly be blamed if he concludes that on that first Easter morning, a divine miracle has occurred. Thank you.
Now we get ready for Bob Price.
Dr. Price will have 20 minutes.
After what you just heard about me, you don't really want to clap, admit it. I'm going to save response to some of the specific points for the next little go-round, but read a prepared statement I came up with, and we'll see where it goes from here. Dr. Craig often appeals to the consensus of New Testament scholars on behalf of conservative views. By contrast, I am glad to confess that the opinion of the majority of scholars makes no difference whatever to me. In fact, in the Gospels, after all, it's a consensus of scholars in the Sanhedrin that condemns Jesus to death. As Francis Schaeffer used to say, you can't settle the question of truth by a majority vote. I think Martin Luther and Galileo and others knew that too. If I am interested in a question, I must examine the issues for myself. I reject, for example, Velikovsky's astronomy, not because the Academy sneers at it, which I guess they do, but because his methodology seems flawed to me as I understand it. And forgive me, but so does Dr. Craig's. First, let me call attention to two fundamental axioms of...
Dude, by the way, Price is a poet and he didn't even know it. Let's keep it real. Like, this guy's wicked with words.
Dr. Craig's work. The first is what strikes me as a kind of double truth model. The second is the old red herring attempt to evade the principle of historical analogy by means of the claim that critics reject miracle stories only because they espouse philosophical naturalism. The second follows from the first, and both commit the fallacy of ad hominem argumentation even while projecting it onto the opponent. I think he tips his hand toward at the end of the first chapter of his book, Reasonable Faith. He draws a distinction there between knowing Christianity is true and showing that it is true. He says, what then should be our approach in apologetics? It should be something like this. My friend, I know Christianity is true because God's Spirit lives in me and assures me that it is true. And you can know it too because God is knocking at the door of your heart, telling you the same thing. If you are sincerely seeking God, then God will give you assurance that the gospel is true. Now, to show you it's true, I'll share with you some arguments and evidence that I really find convincing.
It sounds like he's starting with what he already believes, and now we're going to show how true what we already believe is. Mormon apologists do this, Muslim apologists, every frickin' apologist does the same thing.
To evade the principle of historical analogy by means of the claim that critics reject miracle stories only because they espouse philosophical naturalism. The second follows from the first, and both commit the fallacy of ad hominem argumentation even while projecting it onto the opponent. I think he tips his hand toward at the end of the first chapter of his book, Reasonable Faith. He draws a distinction there between knowing Christianity is true and showing that it is true. He says, what then should be our approach in apologetics? It should be something like this. My friend, I know Christianity is true because God's Spirit lives in me and assures me that it is true. And you can know it too because God is knocking at the door of your heart, telling you the same thing. If you are sincerely seeking God, then God will give you assurance that the gospel is true. Now, to show you it's true, I'll share with you some arguments and evidence that I really find convincing. But should my arguments seem weak and unconvincing to you, that's my fault, not God's. It only shows that I'm a poor apologist, not that the gospel is untrue. Whatever you think of my arguments, God still loves you and holds you accountable. I'll do my best to present good arguments to you, but ultimately you have to deal not with arguments, but with God himself, page 48. A little further on, he saith, unbelief is at the root a spiritual, not an intellectual problem. Sometimes an unbeliever will throw up an intellectual smokescreen so that he can avoid personal, existential involvement with the gospel. Pages 49 to 50. Dr. Craig then freely admits his conviction arises from purely subjective factors. To me, it sounds no different in principle from the teenage Mormon door knocker. He tells you he knows the Book of Mormon was written by ancient Americans because he has a warm, swelling feeling inside when he asks God if it's true. Certain intellectual questions have to receive certain answers, then, to be consistent with this revivalistic, heartwarming experience. So Dr. Craig knows in advance that, for example, Strauss and Bultmann must have been wrong. And by hook or by crook, he'll find a way to get from here to there. His enterprise is circular since he grounds Christian belief upon a subjective state described already in Christian theological terminology, God's Spirit dwelling in his heart, etc.
That's a death blow. Honestly, that's so important, and we've been saying this for a long, long time.
Craig seems to admit that he holds his faith on purely subjective grounds, but maintains that he's lucky to discover that the facts, objectively considered, happen to bear out his faith. Whereas theoretically, his faith might not prove true to the facts. In actuality, it does. In any case, it's obvious from the same quotes that the arguments are ultimately beside the point. If an unbeliever doesn't see the cogency of Dr. Craig's brand of New Testament criticism, the same thing exactly as his apologetics, it can only be because the doubter has some guilty secret to hide and doesn't want to repent and let Jesus run his life. If one sincerely seeks God, Dr. Craig's arguments will mysteriously start looking pretty good to him.
Isn't that ironic? Once they seek God and accept and bend the knee to what Craig's saying, then the arguments start to add up.
Craig's frank expression to his fellow evangelists and apologists is quite revealing. He tells you to say to the unbeliever that you find these arguments really convincing. But how can Dr. Craig simply take this for granted unless, as I'm sure he does, he knows he is writing to people for whom the cogency of the arguments is a foregone conclusion? They are arguments in behalf of a position his readers are already committed to as an a priori party line. His is a position that exalts voluntaristic decision above rational deliberation. Rational deliberation, though good, is by itself not good enough for the evangelist because it can never justify a quick decision, such as Campus Crusade's booklet, The Four Spiritual Laws, solicits. Every one of Dr. Craig's scholarly articles on the resurrection implicitly ends with that little decision card for the reader to sign to invite Jesus into his heart as his personal savior. He's not trying to do disinterested historical or exegetical research. He's trying to get folks saved. I know the feeling. I used to be the president of my InterVarsity chapter. Note how he characterizes people who do not accept his version of the historical Jesus as unbelievers, who merely cast up smoke screens of insincere carping. But this functions as a mirror image of his own enterprise. His apparently self-effacing pose, if my arguments fail to convince, then I must have done a poor job of explaining them, just reveals the whole exercise to be a sham. The arguments are offered cynically, whatever it takes. If they don't work, take your pick between brimstone, God holds you accountable, and treacle, God still loves you. I'm not saying Dr. Craig is wittingly distorting the truth to win his point. Obviously he's not. But he is so committed to a dogmatic party line that he cannot see truth as meaning anything but that party line. Just as Kelly a moment ago said that truth ought to mean a person, not an abstract concept. In Dr. Craig's lexicon, you look up truth and it says, see gospel. To borrow Francis Schaeffer's terminology again, for the apologist, truth becomes merely a connotation word. Just as liberal theologian Albrecht Ritschl said, Jesus has the value of God for us, the apologist might say, Christianity has the value of truth for us. Just as William James said that righteous endeavor was the moral equivalent of war, for apologists, Christianity is the moral equivalent of truth. Only it doesn't work. For Ritschlianism, Jesus was in fact not God. For William James, moral endeavor was not, in fact, war. Even so, anything that substitutes for the truth may be preferred to the truth, but then it's a fiction. If the charge that unbelievers are hiding behind a smokescreen is a mirror image of the apologist's own strategy, then the naturalistic presuppositions business is a specific instance of such childish, I know you are, but what am I tactics. Does it take a blanket presupposition for a historian to discount some miracle stories, like Elisha's axe head on the one extreme or the resurrection of Jesus on the other, as legendary? No, because as Bultmann recognized, there is no problem accepting reports even of extraordinary things that we can verify as still occurring today, like faith healings and exorcisms. However you may wish to account for them, you can go to certain meetings and see scenes resembling those in the Gospels. So it is by no means a matter of rejecting all miracle stories on principle. Biblical critics are not like Carl Sagan or James Randi, going into every investigation already convinced that the paranormal must be a fraud. No, they take miracle stories on a case-by-case basis. But such a selective, piecemeal, and probabilistic acceptance of miracle stories is not what apologists want. They take umbrage that biblical critics do not wind up accepting any and all biblical miracles. So, if it would not require a blanket principle to reject the historicity of particular miracle stories, we must ask if it would take a blanket principle to require acceptance of all biblical miracles. Clearly it would, and that principle cannot be mere supernaturalism, that is, openness to the possibility that miracles can occur. One can believe God capable of anything without believing that he actually did everything anybody may say he did.
This is a very interesting thing that Bob just said. So you've got William Lane Craig, who literally accepts every biblical miracle as though they happen. And when you pin him down to like the zombie apocalypse at the end of Matthew, he goes, well, we're not sure if that was apocalyptic or not. You don't want to die on the hill because it's so not historically verifiable at all. It's this one spot, doesn't get mentioned anywhere else in the New Testament, especially not outside of this. But Bob's point is reverse that. You talk about people just denying all miracles. How come your blanket position is to accept them all? But you only accept them within that canon. You're not actually accepting the miracles of the other gods or the other figures. You probably don't even accept non-canonical legends that have miracle events. Of course, you would say they didn't happen.
One can believe in the possibility of miracles without believing that every reported miracle must have occurred. No, the requisite principle for accepting all biblical miracles is the principle of biblical inerrancy, the belief that all biblical narratives are historically accurate simply because they appear in the Bible. After all, it will not greatly upset Dr. Craig any more than it upset Warfield to deny the historical accuracy of medieval reports of miracles wrought by the Virgin Mary or the sacramental wafer, much less stories of miracles wrought by Gautama Buddha or Apollonius of Tyana. Supernaturalism is not at all the issue here. The issue is whether the historian is to abdicate his role as a sifter of evidence by accepting the dogma of inerrancy, even if clandestinely. I know Dr. Craig says he is sticking only to the elements of the gospel story accepted as historical by most scholars, but this is only tactical. He's shortening the apologetical line of defense. Once he has you in the fold, he'll press on to full inerrantism. Nor is naturalism the issue when the historian employs the principle of analogy. As F.H. Bradley showed in the Presuppositions of Critical History, no historical inference is possible unless the historian assumes a basic analogy of past experience with present experience. If we do not grant this, nothing will seem amiss in believing stories that A turned into a werewolf or B changed lead into gold. Hey, just because we don't see it happening today doesn't prove it never did. One could just as easily accept the historicity of Jack and the Beanstalk on the same basis as long as one's sole criterion for historical plausibility is anything goes. If there are ancient parallel legends about other saviors and sages rising from death or ascending into heaven, but there is no present-day instance, is the historian to be maligned as a narrow dogmatist or a moral coward refusing to repent if he judges the story of Jesus' resurrection as probably a legend too?
This, I love Bob. Bob's so on point here. So on point.
The historical axiom of analogy does not dogmatize. Critical historians are not engaging in metaphysics and epistemology as if they could hop into a time machine and pontificate, A didn't happen, B did. Again, Dr. Craig and his brethren are just projecting. It is they and not critical historians who want to be able to point to sure results. Imagine a creed. If thou shalt confess with thy mouth the Lord Jesus and believe in thy heart that God hath probably raised him from the dead, thou shalt most likely be saved.
Look, there's no one who does this like Robert Price, honestly. This guy is so witty. So witty.
Now, who's the joke on there? Historians don't have creeds. They frame hypotheses. Sure, you can find some hidebound prop, some small-minded, insecure windbag who will not budge from a pet theory because he has too much personally invested in it. But you have no trouble recognizing such a person as a hack, a fake, a bad historian who ought to know better, Holocaust deniers, for example. The last thing you do is to emulate such behavior and make it into an operating principle. But apologists do. Again, it's projection. It reduces to this. At the end of the Four Spiritual Laws booklet, there's a cartoon diagram showing a toy locomotive engine labeled fact, pulling a coal car labeled faith, followed in turn by a superfluous caboose tagged feeling. The new convert is admonished to let faith rest on fact, not to allow faith to waver with feelings. But one must suspect that it is the caboose that is pulling the train and pulling it backward. Faith is based firmly on feeling, and certain notions are postulated as fact and defended as such because of the security they afford the sick soul who seeks support in the existential storm. Dr. Craig has had occasion to cross swords with John Dominic Crossan. One need not agree with Crossan, I seldom do, to appreciate that he is, however, an innovative and creative New Testament scholar, that he marshals his vast learning in an attempt to find out new things from the Gospels. Crossan is concerned to advance the state of knowledge. Contrast him with Dr. Craig, who uses his own formidable erudition in one vast damage control operation. Every effort of Dr. Craig's is to squelch new theories that threaten to cast doubt on the traditional picture of the storybook Jesus. One feels that Dr. Craig would sooner put his efforts elsewhere than putting out fires lit by Bultmann, Strauss, and Crossan. If he had his way, he'd be occupied with something more edifying. At least that's a feeling I get. Evangelicals think they've got the truth in their back pocket, so they can't be trying to find what they think they've already got. Novelty is the devil. They expend great time and efforts mastering the skills of Greek and Hebrew exegesis. Witness the unparalleled excellence of Dallas Theological Seminary in these areas. But for what? All their efforts at exegesis are the laborings of a mountain to bring forth a mouse. If one of them really comes up with something new theologically, it will result in immediate charges of heresy. The effort is solely to hold the fort against the advance of intellectual history.
We saw that with Michael Licona when he took that Matthew apocalypse, the zombie apocalypse, and he thought, this probably isn't historical. And he was fired from a job for it. And this is within Christianity. Like, we're not even dealing with scholars who've been like ostracized and lost jobs in secular, positions.
Dr. Craig everywhere presupposes a pre-critical picture of the Gospels as straightforward records of reporting without tendential bias. He tries to make the Mark and empty tomb tale a piece of sober contemporary history. We're told that the story is unvarnished history since it betrays no signs of theological tendency. No theological coloring? In a story told to attest the resurrection of the Son of God from the dead? What else is it? Isn't it all varnish? Formica instead of wood? Charles Talbert, by the way, no God-hating atheist, but a Southern Baptist, in his book, What is a Gospel, has no trouble adducing abundant parallels from Hellenistic hero biographies in which the ascensions into heaven of Romulus, Aeneas, Hercules, Aristeas, Empedocles, Apollonius, etc., are inferred from the utter failure of their searching disciples to find any vestige of their bones, bodies, or clothing where they might be expected to be found. Sometimes they make a post-mortem appearance to their grieving and worshipful followers. These stories, like all ancient miracle tales, include the element of initial skepticism by the disciples, who were then convinced despite themselves. It's just a narrative device.
That's literally what Apollonius of Tyana has. One doubter comes in, he ends up getting this apparition, so to speak, or some visitation by Apollonius of Tyana, and then he's persuaded. He's convinced that Apollonius is in heaven, and he is obviously a son of a god, etc., etc. And this happens over and over. I think Buddha has it and stuff. So Price is hitting the nail, literally, with the hammer. And this is what we've been hitting with MythVision. So I don't think a lot of people in the world at large have recognized the strength of this. Why comparing it and finding other characters who have similar types of tales, nothing is Xerox copy, is super important on making these cases.
None of them are factual reports. Talbert concludes that the empty tomb and resurrection stories in the Gospels would have been familiar genres to ancient readers, as of course they were. Pagan critics hastened to point out the similarities, and Christian apologists lamely countered that Satan had counterfeited the Gospel episodes in advance to throw unbelievers off the track.
Dude, that is such a red flag. Anybody who's looking at like Justin Martyr saying, nah, Satan, demons long ago, it made it look like Jesus. They imitated the Christ. What? So that they could trick people into thinking those false sons of gods and resurrections and whatnot are worthy of following. And I don't know if Craig's going to get into all these weeds. I don't remember watching this all. So you're literally getting fresh reaction here.
Contra Dr. Craig, the empty tomb story is theological through and through. If we're truly interested in history, how can we dismiss other ancient vanished body and post-mortem appearance stories, making an exception in the single case of Jesus, who just happens to be the founder of our religion? And once we recognize the gospel resurrection narratives to be cut from the same cloth, all questions of whether the women went to the wrong tomb or if the disciples stole the body or rented it or whatever, or whether the Sanhedrin could have produced it with dental records to prove who it was, or whether the disciples saw hallucination or a case of mistaken identity, it's all seemed to be moot.
Dude, this is fantastic. Craig needs this. People watching need to pay attention. Ladies and gentlemen, that is Dr. Robert M. Price. Both 20-minute openings have been completed. This is the first part. We're going to continue in our next video reacting to the remainder of this debate. It's a lot, And I'll tell you, Craig has really met a match here when it comes to people who study the New Testament. Debating Christopher Hitchens isn't going to do it when it comes to the New Testament. Debating the moral guy, Kagan, on ethics and morality and can you have that without God? Like, those are specialists in their own areas on what they do. When it comes to Bible, baby, nobody I know is going to do it like Dr. Robert M. Price. So, hit that subscribe button, check that bell off, comment down below what you liked about this, and of course, share it out there. And until next time, see you then.